All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Dev Empathy Book Club, where we inspire each other to become better developers and better people by building our empathy skills. So this week will be the first week where we go over the book Radical Candor. I read it as an audiobook, so I don't have anything to hold up right now. But the book is by Kim Scott. If you look, Ariel has the book there.
Yeah, I think I have the British edition where they got rid of the profanity on the cover.
Yes. If you bought the American edition of the book, it says how to be a kick-ass boss without losing your humanity. And this is exciting for me in a way in that this is our first modern book, I guess I could say. To an extreme example, this book came out this year. This is like a recent book, which is interesting contrast to some of the ones we've read recently.
I think it might be an update of a book that's like a little older than that, but not even by much. Because I'm pretty like the way I heard of it, and it could be that this is just the book, and before it was just an idea.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that this book came to be part of this this club is actually kind of interesting because it's sort of the reason that there is the club. Meaning, so the inspiration for Dev Empathy Book Club was actually a talk at RubyConf, not this past one, which happened after the club started, but the one before it, where it was basically about how to give good feedback. And the speaker, Paulette Luftig, who at the time was working at Mavenlink, she specifically pointed to Radical Candor as kind of a framework for thinking about how you give effective feedback, and that was sort of it was sort of an interesting way of thinking about things for me. And she also recommended some books, and I bought a bunch of books, and and then I said, well, I don't want to read them all alone, and so eventually that turned into Dev Empathy Book Club. So we have Kim Scott to thank for the book club existing.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't actually know that entire story. I knew pieces of it, but I'm glad I read this book. So to kind of start us off with like an overview, this is going to be us talking about the first half of the book, and the book's pretty neatly cut into two, with kind of an overview of the concept of radical candor, how Kim outlines that being used in basically defining terms, which makes a lot of sense when you're trying to like add a new term to the lexicon, basically. And then the second half, which we haven't gotten into yet, is more practical advice, application of all of this. How can you turn your job around by using radical candor in the way you do things? So basically, the book's kind of jumps into, I would say, 4 sections after the intro that kind of goes over these different quadrants of this square that Kim refers to a few times, which is, I don't know if she gives it a title itself. I know it's like the Radical Candor square, but I don't know if there's a title for that, that actual diagram. And I think what I'll do is I'll just give you all a quick overview of what that is, and then we can kind of dive into individual stories about parts of that. And then I'll jump over to Ariel to give his thoughts on the whole thing from a high level. So basically, if you can't see the image, right, basically what it looks like is it's a box, and you have on the upper right caring personally and challenging directly, and then through that you have 4 quadrants. And what she does is she defines what it means to be in any one of these quadrants of the square diagram, and then what it means to be a boss who's in there or to have a boss that's there. And that would be it. So if you look over there, Ariel's got it open. So she goes into what it means to be in any one of these and what the benefit of those is. Of course, the book would say being in the radical candor quadrant is the correct one. That's the one you actually want to be in as a boss. And what that basically refers to is something I think I really like, or I really agree with, which is actually caring about people, which I think is kind of the crux of the whole idea of dev empathy, is to care about the people we work with, care about the people we work for or work under, and to have the understanding to challenge directly. And I felt the book opened very powerfully in that regard, that it referred to a situation where Kim personally had a failure of not challenging someone, and how that ended badly for everyone. And that is something that I can not personally relate to. I haven't been in that same situation, but it's something I've seen happen. The story that she's referring to is, you know, one where she had an employee that was underperforming, and instead of telling them that they're performing, allowed it to get out of hand until the person eventually had to be fired. And that is a completely circumventable problem. That is something you can totally just avoid through better management. And I think using that as kind of one of the kernels for starting off this book and this story kind of puts you on the right path for understanding where Kim's coming from when she writes this book. So before I dive into any specifics, like Ariel, what are your thoughts on the kind of the premise of the book overall?
Yeah, I'm actually going to hold this up again. So I sort of like, you know, had a little creepy, like, look at me, I'm peeking out from behind the book. But I really did want to kind of emphasize the diagram itself. And I just want to point out, this is like my sort of junky version of slides right here. It's just holding up a book to the screen. I just wanted there to be like one page in this book where they have just a big copy of the diagram, but unfortunately that's not there. Anyway, but I want to sort of focus on the two dimensions here, right? There's care personally, and I can't read it because it's, there we go. Challenge directly. So the sort of interesting thing to me is less the relationship between the two and more sort of the lack of relationship. In other words, we sort of tend to jump in and assume that the way that I challenge someone, or at the very least whether I'm challenging them, is a function of caring personally. You know, so if we're looking on that diagram again, I can't believe I put it away. Okay. If we're looking on that diagram again, so you sort of imagine like, you know, a line that goes like this. Like, of course, it's a one-to-one relationship. You know, but in reality, that's not true, right? They're independent variables, and someone can care a lot, but you know, it's not necessarily I guess, you know, being nice all the time, so to speak. That there can be direct challenges that come out of love, and there can be direct challenges that come out of a lack of caring. And the same thing is true for not speaking. So, you know, there's the third element, which is just how you challenge directly, which I think the book, you know, sort of, and we'll get into this a little bit more, I think, as we go on. But I think the book is a little bit lacking, or there's some things that I very fundamentally disagree with about how you challenge. You know, I think it doesn't really address it all that well. But whether you're challenging definitely is kind of independent of that, you know, caring, and it's very true that how you care will determine a lot of how your challenges are perceived. So to me, that was kind of a really good, useful, interesting point to think about.
Yeah, I can say for me personally, this book comes at an interesting time because I run my own company, and even though I've been a manager before, I've been a boss before, it's different thinking of it as I am now this quote unquote boss, and everyone I hire is under me, and I have to consider my actions more consciously. I can't just decide, oh, I'll just run things like I run things, because the way I treat people will have real effects on them. And as being the boss, I can't just tell someone else they're not performing and they fire them, which has been how it is in most cases. Jobs I've had in the past, that will eventually be on me if that happens, and I don't want that to happen. So it was nice to hear these stories and listen to this person who's done this at a much larger scale, like how things have gone well and how things have gone wrong, and then trying to reconcile that with my own understanding and belief of like how to interact with other people. And I think as we get into more of these details here, we don't always agree. I think that's okay. Like, I don't always agree with the way Kim outlines having these conversations and having these agreements with people, or disagreements, as it might be. But I did find, I feel like I personally got a lot out of the book at the same time, of just ways of thinking and approaching problems in subtle ways, especially like even back to the graph again, just thinking about where am I in this chart? I've definitely had bosses in the two edges that aren't the bottom left. I've had the aggressive one, which, let me see, I have the thing here, obnoxiously aggressive. I've had the bosses who you can tell don't care about you, and they don't mind telling you your work is shit, and it hurts really bad. Like, it is not a fun environment to be in. And I've also definitely had that like ruinous empathy bosses. I've had bosses who care a lot about me a lot, but they don't ever tell you you're doing something wrong, and they don't tell anyone they're doing anything wrong. And you can, it's like this slow, insidious like thing where people's kind of like don't feel challenged and they don't feel like they're growing, or things just go really badly and no one knows until it's way too late. So I like the idea of you can acknowledge these things and you can try to move yourself to a situation where you understand where am I at and why am I here. I am lucky too. I don't think I've ever had a boss who was manipulatively unsincere, at least not in tech. I probably had those waiting tables, but that was, you know, a different industry.
Yeah, I actually think I might have had one of those at a certain point when I was in a different field. Essentially I had a boss who like on the surface seemed really, really nice. And you know, it could be that this was just my experience because other people who worked for the same boss, you know, had experiences that were just fine. But essentially like things would seem, you know, and honestly, like thinking about, you know, sort of how the book, I think the author kind of tries to avoid saying it, but it's like pretty clear that it's true. There are very different attitudes towards that horizontal line, right? How directly you challenge people in East versus West. So, you know, this may have been like an Eastern culture, Western culture thing in this situation, but like she very rarely would challenge me in a direct way, except when like if there's something that you disagree with, it was sort of like actually I think we do it this way, and that was sort of it. But there was not like really a sense of, you know, I'm not satisfied with your work. And then like one day sort of, you know, she got angry enough that like she fired me. So
yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, it was sort of a really soul crushing experience, you know, at the end there. And I really would have appreciated a lot more honest feedback. I've also had the obnoxiously aggressive boss where I really could do no right. And that was a whole different experience. But you know, at least I sort of saw it coming.
Yeah, you kind of know what you're going to get in that situation.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good one. So I feel we have a few. I feel like there's like more than one elephant in the room with this book, and we have to just pick which one we want to talk about first.
And there's also like a lot of really little interesting points that are maybe worth delving into as just like, here's a good example of something that is actually valuable to think about. So, you know, it's not just the big points. I think there were a lot of really good little points to learn as well.
Yeah, agreed. I'll just dive into one of the ones that I really liked a lot, and I know you liked it as well, which was the idea of rock stars versus superstars. I had never heard that dichotomy laid out in that way, and I remember, so I listened to the book as an audiobook, and I got out of my car when I got to work, and I started like messaging people on Slack about this distinction, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's so good!" And like, I think somewhere in the back of my head understood this, but hadn't materialized in such a way. So to anyone still not sure what it is, the idea here is that your rock stars are not like, you know, your ninja kung fu unicorn that you hear in the startup world, but the idea of someone who is, you know, stable and dependable and in for the long run, versus your superstars are like a shooting star. That's the person you normally think of as the rock star ninja from like the, you know, LinkedIn job postings. The person who's always looking for the newer, better job and the better position, they want to go and they're super out there. Kim outlines that like you need both. You can't just have a team of all superstars, which is what a lot of startups try to do, and then to wonder why their team doesn't work. You need a lot of rock stars. Like you need a lot of people who are in it for the long run. And I love this because I have found people who feel very alienated by tech because they feel like there's no space for them because they enjoy their work and they want to work someplace for a long time. But like this brings out the point that, hey, as a manager, it's very important to hire those people because they are going to be your like the reason why your team exists. And like it's so true. Everywhere I've worked, there has been the rock stars who kind of held everything together, even though they don't get the praise. So this was kind of like, give them some of the praise, recognize them as what they are, and I think you'll have a better team. And that was just like the whole book could have been worth it for that. Like that was just so great for me. Was that one? Ariel, you had some thoughts on this. What are your?
Yeah. Oh, wow. It's so much on this whole rock stars, superstars thing. I happen to hate the terminology. That's like
Same.
that's not a relevant point. Like I just don't like calling, I don't like the idea of like everyone's a star. And I don't mean that in a nasty way, like, oh, well, some people are special and some people are, mediocre. And I'm just saying that like the it sort of plays into the passion gospel and this whole thing about how, I think ultimately what it does is it puts a lot more pressure on employees to perform, beyond a reasonable degree, to it ends up being less of the work smart, more of the work hard, and I think it can be very unhealthy in terms of how it just encourages employees to basically work extra for free, as opposed to thinking about how to work smart and focus on learning and developing themselves. So that's a terminology thing. It's its own discussion, but I sort of did feel the need to just kind of bring that up. But I really do like the idea of sort of acknowledging that and to me sort of the main point here was that there's rapid growth as a superstar and rapid growth as a rock star, and just because someone is not a superstar doesn't mean that they're not growing really, really quickly. And one thing that I was thinking about is like in my early days as a developer, and this is very common with junior developers. I mean, they're worth doubles and triples and quadruples in the first year, and their salaries generally don't, which is why they tend to move. Junior developers like very often move companies within the first year or around that 1 year mark, just because the company isn't growing their salary fast enough to really recognize that, which is its own problem, right? But that is kind of like a really interesting rock star phase, because you're sort of like, you come in, you're very new at this, you don't know what you're doing, and just to kind of do your daily work requires a tremendous amount of growth, and that actually should kind of happen every time you move into a significantly different role. So whether you're moving from a junior developer to a more senior developer, a mentor, moving from there maybe into management, maybe moving from management into like a sort of a more interesting, high level senior individual contributor kind of a role, which as an aside, like it's sort of funny that we have this whole path of like, we imagine superstars are just kind of like growing in first you're an individual contributor, then you're a team lead, then you're maybe an architect, and then you're moving into real management, and and that's kind of like the ladder. And I think part of the point of rock stars versus superstars is it's not a ladder. It's just there's a whole bunch of different things that need to get done, and it's all about finding what is the place that matches the degree of growth that you're wanting to put in right now, and the kind of growth, right? The degree and the kind, right? Rockstar versus superstar being about the kind, and then degree being how quickly are you growing. So it's sort of interesting that that again with that superstar track, we really make a lot of room for one kind of superstar track, but there may be superstar tracks that we're not thinking about that involve moving in the opposite direction. Obviously not senior to junior, but maybe more again management back into technology. And it's a little sad that I can think of one person that I saw recently who moved from one company to another because he was done with management, but you can't move from management back into tech. And I think big companies like maybe Google probably does this. I'm guessing does it well because you can move pretty freely within the broader company. But it's a little sad that smaller organizations haven't figured out how to do that really well. So that was a little bit all over the map, but hopefully it was fairly coherent.
No, I think what you said makes a lot of sense, and yeah, I totally agree with. I feel like as a culture, like in tech, we kind of created this idea that rock stars are all that exist. Just the fact that both of us disagree with it, but we never thought of another word for this idea, like just shows how pervasive it is, where it's like, I know people who have just adapted their entire way of thinking about their career to this idea. Well, if I've been here for 2 years, I have to move. Why? Well, because it's bad if I don't. They can't articulate why it's bad to stay. It's just that they were told their career is bad if they're not always moving and going to the next better thing. And a lot of people feel like they're not being valued if they don't do that, because they stay at the same job and then the company just kind of not takes advantage of it in a conscious way, but they, like you said, they don't have a track for what it's like to stay in a position or to move up in, I'm really good at this, not going to senior to lead to architect to management and then you never touch anything again. Like it's helpful to have that. I remember getting some hiring advice a long time ago, which in contrast to this book is horrible, which was only hire people that you would regret not hiring 6 months later. And it basically, the whole hiring process was around only hiring, shooting star people, only hiring those people that are going to like on a rocket trajectory and like grabbing them on the way up. We hired a lot of good people that way, but you hired a lot of people who were like, had sometimes had personality conflicts, or like, they weren't stable. They wanted to jump to another job. There was a lot of things that just, there was a lot of cost for always gearing towards that person. And I think having a more broader perspective that this chapter or this concept kind of gives you helps a lot, especially with the idea of not everyone's in the same position their entire career. Like that was another big one, another really good one of like, some people are on that, all-star trajectory or superstar trajectory, and then eventually they decide to level off and they're your rock star. And the idea that people even on your team while they work for you aren't static in one or the other, it's like such a good thing to keep in mind. Like as a manager, as a boss, you need to remember like, hey, this person wanted to grow rapidly for the first 2 years they were here. They might not want to. Don't push them to a promotion they might not want. I think that has a lot to do with actually caring about them and keeping track of like, where they're at, instead of just pushing for the next promotion because of something you remember hearing, forever ago. It's like when an obscure relative gives you a present for like a holiday and you're like, I haven't liked this thing in a decade, but that's the last time they remember interacting with you. So they just decided to give you, a saxophone for your birthday. You're like, I don't play saxophone. I don't know what you're talking about. One of those.
Yeah, I was actually reminded now of when I applied for the Flatiron School. So they at the time, I don't know what their website is doing right now, but at the time they kind of had this thing on the website about, here is how we select people who are going to attend. And they basically said, we don't recruit individuals, we recruit a class, we recruit an entire cohort. And so, if we there's, just as an example, right? Let's say there's, 8 people who were coming from the world of finance who, got bitten by the coding bug. We're not going to accept all 8, no matter how good they are, even if they're like all shining stars and they're going to be way better than everyone else. Doesn't matter. We're trying to create a cohort as a whole that's going to have a certain degree of diversity and different kind of life perspectives. Because that creates something for the entire experience. And when we think about hiring superstars, or stars in general, right? I'm only partially speaking in terms of the book here. When we think about we only want like when I see companies that say we only hire the best, I don't think that's actually a great idea. I think you want to hire the best team. When you're focusing too much on the individuals who are going to be the best. Well, who says that they work well together, and who says that they're going to be the best performing team? And the sad part is that usually ends up focusing on technical skills rather than people skills, which makes it even worse most of the time. But that is a bit far afield from Rockstars versus Superstars. It just kind of jumped off those the last set of comments.
Yeah, I think in the grand scheme of things, it's all kind of related as we kind of dive into this. But so one thing I did want to talk about was something that actually Ariel had wanted to talk about, which was the idea of should your boss be your friend? Since we're kind of on book topics that are not exactly in the book, but I think there's something that comes up when you read the book. And I know you have something to say on it, and I kind of want you to go first, and then I can kind of give my thoughts afterwards. Yep. I think we'll be in agreement, but I don't know if we'll be on exactly the same page.
Yep. I much as I have issues with the way that the book talks about, a fairly obnoxious sounding kind of a culture of disagreement. I do like the idea of us not agreeing, because I think that gives everyone who's watching and listening, the sort of a reminder that it's not like, because someone said it on the internet, therefore it's true. We're just offering our own ideas and our own thoughts and our own perspectives, and we each bring something to the table. But everyone else who's out there who's listening, you also have your own thoughts and your own personality, your own experiences that will very much complement anything that we say, or that this book says, or that any book says. So with that in mind, should your boss be your friend? And this was sort of like a hard thing for me to read as I was going through. There's definitely a personality element to this, and I think sort of part of the point of being a boss is you don't always get to choose, and maybe you shouldn't always get to choose, right? The personalities of the people that you're working with, and the part of the idea of a boss is you have to be flexible enough to meet different kinds of people's needs. But I was sort of a little bit troubled by the expectation of, oh, you're just going to be friends with the people who work for you, and you're going to be involved in their lives, and you're going to be you're going to be their psychologist. I very much come from a mental place of, I have my work life at work and I have my home life at home. And it's not to say that the twain shall never meet, but what it's saying is that, when I go to work, I have a certain mindset, and, and I'm well aware that not everybody has that mindset. There are people who go to work and they just can't wait to hang out with their friends and, share pictures of their latest vacation, or, look at what my kid is doing now. Isn't my baby so cute? And I'm always a little bit uncomfortable when people ask me to share that stuff at work, because I very much compartmentalize those two elements of my life. And I'm definitely not the only one who feels that way. I've definitely heard from other people who may or may not be part of my family. So there could be a genetic component here, right? But about how their coworkers get very personal, sometimes very graphic, with details of their own lives that they'd really rather just not know about. You do your thing, I do mine. And so it sort of started to make me wonder, if that's kind of my approach, is the book saying that, were I to go into management, I would not be a good manager because I don't like having those kinds of conversations in a work context. Because I kind of have the attitude of yes, I might meet people at work who I get along really well with and I enjoy hanging around. But that doesn't mean that just because I spend 8 hours in an office with you, or a virtual office, as the case may be, that I would just naturally gravitate towards you and be your friend. I think it's kind of okay to just say like any other element of my life that I'm involved with. If I make friends, that's great, and if I don't, that's fine too. So is a boss who's a friend the only kind of good boss? I definitely agree that bosses have to care about their employees, at least to the extent of saying, well, here are the needs that you have right now in order to do well at your job, or here's the flexibility that we need to provide in terms of creating a humane work environment, right? If there's things going on in your life, yes, absolutely, share that with the boss, and then the boss should be able to to have some flexibility, to create or have the flexibility of giving you the time and the flexibility that you need in terms of your work arrangement. But I don't know if it really deeply needs to go beyond that. So that's kind of my take on it. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I would say all your thoughts are valid and not something I've heard that before. You know what I mean? That's definitely something that people feel, and I think that's fair. I don't think I can't really disagree with you. You know what I mean? If we're not having a debate, I think we just see it differently. What I would say, I think for me the difference is not it's not a should a boss be your friend, or does your boss have to be your friend. I think that distinction is where it kind of lies. If this was phrased differently, does every boss you have to be your friend, or does every person under you have to be your friend as a boss, then I would say absolutely not. But I would say should there be the capacity to be friends with those people, then I would say yes. Same thing with the being a counselor kind of a thing. I've been a manager in several positions where it does feel like you're someone's psychologist, and not about personal issues, like never about their home life or about their relationships or their kids, just about work. And I think being open to being emotionally vulnerable is more important than being open about things about your actual life. And I would say that's where I lie too. I hang out with people that are my, employees. I hang out with people that I used to work under all the time, but we always talk about work. Like I would call them my friends, but we don't talk about our personal lives. Sometimes I find out they're in Seattle and I'm like, what? Like, oh yeah, they don't have to tell me that because it's not important to our relationship. Our relationship is we are friends who work together, and that's where it ends. And maybe on a rare occasion when things are very casual away from a work setting, we'll talk about family or talk about something else. And I think where I fall on this is, as a boss, you're not required to be a good boss. You're not required to be someone's close friend or confidant or psychologist, but you need to be willing to be available for them when things are tough. And you should be like aware enough of things that are going on in their life so that when someone asks for a day off, you can tell the difference between someone who's actually struggling and someone who just wants a day off. Because I think the fear would be, if it's all super closed off as a manager, then you just play by the numbers. Oh, you've already had a week off this year. Sorry, you don't get any more time. And I think that's what they're pushing towards. But I definitely agree with you, Ariel, that I always have this weird aversion to people wanting to be super buddy from like a boss perspective, because it feels like that cult of passion you referred to earlier. It refers back to this idea of, oh, we have to be really close because this is where you live now. Like this is your entire life, is this job. And I don't ever like working at those places. And now as someone who owns a company, I don't want my work to be that type place. I'd rather give people the flexibility to have freedom with their own lives. And whatever they share with me is what they share. And if I feel like it's stepping over a boundary, then I can say, hey, I don't need to know that. Exactly. You said that. There's a lot of things I don't need to know. And there's some things as a boss I don't want to know. But I do think having some level of friendliness, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with too much of that. I'm sort of starting to wonder as you're saying that, like maybe this is, and Kim Scott is definitely very, very deeply entrenched in the Silicon Valley world, where I think jobs tend to be, people tend to relate to their jobs a little differently than people in the rest of the world. There's very much of that passion gospel. By the way, as an aside, I don't know if this is like a standard term in the industry. I know I got it from a post by Avdi Grimm. So credits to him for that phrase. As far as I know, like that's where it came from. But it could be that it exists out there. But I think we probably all recognize the idea of sort of like worshiping the idea of being passionate about what you do. And oh my goodness, after I read that post, I just hate the word passionate with a passion. So like if your work is your life in that way, maybe a boss in that context really does need to be a confidant, because they're kind of your parent in a way. I think of like a preschool teacher, the kids are, often see the preschool teachers more than they see their parents, or the daycare workers, or whatever it is. And that might be kind of what it's like.
Yeah, I think in some ways it kind of is. And I think a good manager is someone who's okay with that, maybe not someone who encourages that, if that makes sense. I feel like if I was a manager and someone was pushing all of this on me, I would want them to like leave. Not the job, but like work. I'd like, you have to take some time. And those were the moments that she gave examples in the book I really liked, were the ones where it's like, you're dealing with issues in your personal life. I don't want you at work. And I can make that call because I now know you're having these personal issues. Now, I'm not forcing you to leave, but like some people will work themselves to death. Like I know I've worked with those people. They will not stop working even to a fault. And sometimes it helps to have the emotional intelligence as a boss to not just turn a blind eye, but to be like, hey, this is not good for you. It's not good for the team. It's not good for the company. It's definitely not good for you. Like you need to leave and take some time off, or refocus some of your attention. Or there was one example in the book where she mentioned, finding someone a hobby And I was like, that was like amazing. It was like, if I had a boss who like helped me find hobbies, I don't have hobbies. I just work all the time. Like I was that person who would be like coming into work with like a 99-degree fever and just like, it's fine. It's fine. I just need to work one more day. So it was helpful to have bosses who are kind of like understanding of like what you need as a person, not just what you needed for your position.
Yeah, and I just kind of want to throw in, and this is really stemming actually from a personal example, which I'll get to in a sec. But it's not just bosses that can do this. Really, in a workplace context, I think every individual contributor also has the opportunity to create a more humane culture, whether it's in terms of the caring that you show for other people, in terms of maybe it's covering for each other in in a certain way, or sort of realizing, hey, you seem to be having a little trouble with getting this task done. Is there a way I can step in and help out? I think, as an aside, I think that's a really good way to kind of get noticed if you are on that superstar track. But even if you're not, it's something that's just a good neighborly or teammately thing to do, and just setting an example for in a certain sense, maybe even for your boss of this is how a team takes care of each other. The thing that's kind of like bouncing around in rattling around in the back of my head is so I have a friend who it's a little difficult to talk about, but so he and his wife recently lost their child at about 6 weeks. And I mean, the baby was born like, they saw that there was something wrong in like an ultrasound. She was like at the end of the 8th month, immediately, rushed her to the hospital, had the baby early. The baby was in an incubator the whole time, and just it was a really miserable situation for a whole bunch of weeks there. After the baby died, so he sort of spoke about how he works in a warehouse, and I guess in a warehouse probably the tasks to get done are a little bit clearer, and a little bit more time sensitive, because it's very clear if you ship the thing or you didn't, it's he was sort of trying to figure out, do I go to work, do I not go to work, do I do some kind of reduced hours, and basically what ended up happening is he went to work because he really needed something constant and sane in his life. So it actually wouldn't have been healthy to just like send him away and and say just like don't do your work anymore. But his friends in the warehouse covered for him for for a couple hours a day basically. They must have done some kind of rotation, whatever it was. Everyone took a little extra time to show support for each other, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about as everyone in that group basically was stepping up in this very same kind of way to say we're here for you, we understand your needs, we're gonna make the room for you to be here during the time that you're here, and we're gonna make it those hours as great as we can for you, and when you need to go, that's fine, you need to go, and we'll be here to cover to cover your back.
Yeah, that's a tough story, but touching in the way that everyone kind of stood up that way. And it made something I didn't say, because I have been falling into the mindset of just thinking of this from a management perspective, but I do recall reading this book, like this is something everyone could benefit from. I've also definitely worked in places where the only real quote unquote relationship of any kind is like up and down, where like the management knows what's really going on in someone's lives, but no one knows about their peers. And I'm not suggesting everyone to start sharing everything at work. That's also not good. But it isn't, I don't even know how to articulate this. It would benefit the culture of your entire team if everyone was less surface level and more caring about like what's actually going on. Like this idea of radical candor is definitely something you can apply to anyone on your team, where okay, I care about you and I want to give you, actual feedback, and not overly harsh feedback, and not, I'm just going to play it nice and not ever tell you what's actually wrong. Like teams that get that right do really good. Like those teams grow and succeed because people need feedback. Like you need criticism to grow appropriately, but you also need to feel like you're in a safe place to have that criticism. You can't just have someone yelling at you. I definitely worked on a team where one of the developers would go around and yell at everyone about their code, and eventually that person got removed from the team because no one could get work done. It was just so hard to get any work done when everything you wrote would be we undermined and told no, do it the other way. And he wasn't a boss. He was just someone on the team who just felt like their opinion was that important. And like there is a huge middle ground between that extreme and the other extreme of, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. Let me talk to you about a better idea, and then just never doing that either because you're afraid of whatever or you don't want to get involved. And I think everyone could benefit from this approach of just kind of caring about the people you work with and trying to help them out, because that'll eventually help you out in some ways. And I think this is kind of a nice segue into something that I took umbrage with the book a little bit, which was some of the examples of radical candor. When the book would talk about using radical candor, I had a picture in my mind of what that was, and I liked it. And then I would hear because I listened to the audiobook, so I got to hear her putting on the actual story of what this sounded like. And I was just be like, no, that is not how I'm going to pull this off. And it, I curse quite regularly in normal conversation, not so much on this podcast, but I found the profanity in a lot of these examples to be jarring. I was like, if I was on the receiving end of that, I would not be pleasant. And I appreciate that Kim always followed up. At the end of every example was like a disclaimer that would say, don't ever do that. You're not this person. You don't know them. You can't do that. And I appreciate that. But I fear that it might get lost when all the examples are like, cursing someone out or calling them a name. And I'm just like, oh, please. Like there's a huge divide between feedback and feedback that involves profanity and calling people names that you can land on. It doesn't have to be that one,
I think you really hit the nail on the head there when you said all the examples, because I think that really was the problem. It was that all the examples were terrible. If there had been like a couple of examples and, and the point was like, well, this sounds really bad, but let's consider also they're a really caring boss. And so, take it with a grain of salt, like fine. But when all the examples are, here's a thing that you'd never, you really should never say to anybody, but here's why it's okay. That was a little troubling.
Yeah, exactly. I expected there to be a Steve Jobs example that was awful, and it was, and I wasn't surprised by that. And I would give that one a pass, because even she said in the book, "Oh, that's Steve Jobs. You can't do that." I'm like, okay, but then there was like example after example, and I'm just like, I don't like any of these. And to be fair, I feel like you and me might be on the same end of the spectrum. I feel like you and me might push ourselves closer towards the ruinous empathy side of things, like the non-criticizing side. And I think some people who maybe are really far on the other side, maybe this book's pushing them more to the center. I can't really tell where it's trying to do. It feels like it's trying to average everyone. So if you're on one end of the spectrum or the other, you feel like it's pulling you the opposite way. Because I feel like, for me, this book was challenging me to be more critical than I am when I talk to people. And I feel like I pulled some things out of that. I actually really did enjoy the Steve Jobs example, the Apple examples. They talked about separating work from the person, which, again, I don't like the applications that they showed the examples of, but I like the idea of criticizing someone on the work that was submitted, not on them as a person. It reminds me of PR reviews, when you have to make sure you're giving feedback to this person of like, well, this is not the way we want this to be done, not why did you do it this way, not like trying to be accusational about their work, but instead be like, this is the alternative that we are expecting. I like the idea of holding someone to a high standard because I know they can do it, not just criticizing someone because they didn't do what I expected. And I think that is a nice distinction to hold. But what's important is making sure they know you're doing that. And I don't know if in all these examples, the person on the flip side felt that way, because in none of these examples do we hear the other person's reaction. Like, we don't get their internal monologue of how they felt while being yelled at. We just hear third party and then the person who did the yelling saying it was great. So I'm not entirely sure. And just to kind of round that out, there were several examples in the book of confrontation between two people when they couldn't agree, and one person either yells at the person or calls them a name to get them to agree, or someone like Steve Jobs comes in and criticizes someone's work and uses tons of profanity to say why it's so bad. And don't think that's a really a workplace I would like to be in, you know, and 9 out of 10 times, I don't think I want to be in a place where that is the level of expectation of frustration or the level of like open aggression when it comes to disagreements. I have worked in a place like that, and I did not enjoy it. And many people from many different backgrounds did not enjoy it. And that caused a monoculture to develop where only people who were willing and enjoyed arguing loudly with other people were the only ones left at a certain point. And that is not fun. It was just, you know, Thunderdome every other day about commas versus, you know, tabs versus spaces or something. And it was not a pleasant work environment.
Yeah. It's, you know, I'm going to just bring up an example here because, you know, I can, you said we heard the first person here, the third person, but we didn't hear the second person. The person who the comments were addressed to. There's an example which I think I have brought up previously at some point on one of these panels, but it's, you know, it's worth repeating again because it's the same idea. I was once part of a team that it was sort of like a, you know, this extended spike, you know, you can almost say, you know, we were sort of like trying a particular approach to solve a problem and, you know, doing a few sprints through that. And then every couple of weeks we'd have a meeting with upper management to kind of review progress and see what's been happening. So it was like this big scary meeting where we had to have something to show for our efforts and, you know, something that you know, maybe the less technical people could understand. So like a lot of people there, a lot of pressure, you know, people who, you know, have a lot of power in the company, you know, deciding whether your work is good or not. So, you know, I demonstrated a particular endpoint that we had, you know, API endpoint that we had put into place and how it returned all the information that we needed. And here, you know, talking about here are the things that we're going to do with it and whatever. And the most senior technical person on the group that I was in, he happened to be the one who was advocating for the other approach. But he, you know, he asked me, so, you know, what's the response time on this endpoint? So I pulled up developer tool. I say, oh, it's about, you know, 200 milliseconds. He says, 200 milliseconds? That's terrible. And, you know, this is someone who I know from context is absolutely obsessed with performance. And when he said that, what he meant was, I'm very upset right now because I care a lot about the performance of our site. And, you know, we can't have it be backed. You know, if we're gonna have, you know, sub 100 millisecond, you know, response time, we can't rely on an endpoint that takes 200 milliseconds to return. But the way that it was said was absolutely explosive, and I knew it wasn't personal, but it really hurt, and it was really embarrassing in front of, you know, upper management to have somebody telling you that your work is terrible. I can only imagine it's all the more humiliating when it is upper management who's saying your work is terrible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's really not just about, you know, what you're saying and where it's coming from. It is also how you say it, and I think that's something that we have spoken a lot about already in this group, especially with the book Nonviolent Communication, where somehow it always comes back to that. You know, I think nonviolent communication and you know, there's lots of other tools too. There's a lot to think about the way that we say things, because that matters, you know, just as much as, or often even more than what you're actually saying, and even where it's coming from.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think nonviolent communication helped me put a lot of this in perspective. I'm very curious what the world would have been like if we'd read this book first and then nonviolent communication afterwards, because I feel like my thoughts wouldn't have been as nuanced. I feel like I would have had the same gut reaction, but I wouldn't have had the framework for like why that's wrong or how to fix it, other than, oh, I don't like it. You know, I think we've understood a better way of doing this. And one thing that I think you had brought up, Ari, on one of our notes was the idea that, you know, niceness isn't a bank account you can't just make deposits and withdrawals from. And I really enjoyed that, because I think people do think that way, but then they don't realize quite how much their withdrawal amount is worth. You know, how much niceness you're putting in and taking out is kind of like Bitcoin recently. It just kind of goes up and down, and you can't really tell what it's going to be next week. And then people make very wrong assumptions. And that was a reoccurring thing in the book that made me nervous. Was there's an underlying assumption in a lot of this book that the manager has high levels of emotional intelligence, which is definitely far from guaranteed. I'm very curious how the application process in part 2 translates, because of that exact part. Like, I remember listening to chapters and being like, this is amazing. But oh my God, I can think of a dozen managers who would listen to this book and have horrible takeaways, like really bad conclusions from just listening to the first half. And I don't know how you reconcile that. So I'm hoping the second half kind of does. I'm
optimistic too, although a little bit concerned just because of the reactions of certain people that I respect to this book, in particular Sarah May, who kind of pointed to this point too, and she has read the entire book.
Mm-hmm. Oh no! So maybe it doesn't get much better. But yeah, I saw Sarah's tweet about the book, and I'd love to get Sarah's opinion on the whole thing. We should get her on for the second half. But
maybe that would be great.
If she's available, that would be amazing. Yeah, because I remember as she mentioned her tweet, the idea of applying this from a big company to a small company, and there is definitely several cases of that's fine for Google kind of a thing. Like, okay, well, that's what Google does. They have 10,000 employees, or that's what Apple does. They're Apple. Like, there has to be nuance in like how you apply some of these things. And that didn't really seem to be there at all.
I didn't get the sense that Kim Scott has ever worked with a small company, honestly.
No, not not other than like her own startups, but they seem bigger. True. They still seem bigger than most companies I worked for. But I have worked for a lot of small companies. So maybe my perspective is a little skewed as well. And I'm not trying to just rag on the book. Overall, I think I got a lot out of it. It was really good. I think there's a lot of good information in there, but I think with all of these business books, there's a certain amount of fluff added to them. And I think sometimes that can really drag it down. And I feel like some of this was fluff, and it was like, ooh, I don't like that. Like that could have just been removed, and we could have got something a little bit more to the point. So
if I can jump in and maybe return to the bank account stuff for a minute. So it's
please.
The reason that I wrote that actually was goes back, and I'm going to mess up the details honestly, so I'll do my best. But something like this: there was a study that basically looked at a bunch of married couples who were struggling and like in terms of their relationship, and they basically found that there was one marker that could almost without fail predict whether the couple would end up staying together or getting divorced. And that marker was the ratio of positive, warm comments to negative, angry, etc. comments. And the ratio that they found that was necessary was actually 5-1. And the book actually mentions the idea of having some kind of magic ratio, and says don't have magic ratio because it's going to be you're just going to end up being insincere, which is true. And I think probably the point is that you have to just learn how to see the good in people. And maybe the married couples where they were doing less than that 5-1, they just hadn't learned to see the good in each other. But again, the sort of outcome of that study, basically, the way it's generally been interpreted is that being nice is kind of like a bank account, and when you say nasty things, whether your relationship survives is based on whether you meet a certain kind of a magic ratio. So my point was not that the bank account idea is entirely false. My issue was, though, that at that moment, even if you have 100-1. Nice comments to nasty comments. But when you get that one nasty comment, you're not like, oh, this person's usually so nice to me. I'm sure this is just a one-off. This is not a big deal, right? What you say is, this person's always so nice to me. Has it all been a lie? Like we have a very strong tendency as human beings to live in the moment, to kind of take the current events way out of proportion. That may be true about also current events in general, but the current things that are happening to us, we tend to take them way out of proportion and think this defines our relationship in our lives. The second one thing goes wrong, instantly my whole life is miserable and terrible, and nothing, I can't do anything right. And I think that yes, we're going to mess up. We're always going to have situations where we do the things that we would really prefer that we were above doing, but I really do think that the more that we think about the how, and not just the caring and the direct approach, but how we approach directly in a way that builds off of that caring, that conveys that caring, that's really gonna make a big difference in how our comments are received. And in that light, I actually want to jump to sort of the example that that the author gives in terms of when she said a lot in her presentation, and Sheryl Sandberg basically, after trying to say it nicely, ended up saying, when you say it sounds stupid, it makes you sound stupid. And it was sort of funny because the first time that I heard that example, actually, again, in that talk that I referenced at the beginning of this panel, I was sort of like very taken aback. Like, that sounds like not a thing I'd ever want to hear from anybody. Like, I think there are just nicer ways to say it that, that get the point across. And then, I read in the book and I was like, okay, I think there's a little more context. And then I actually watched a TED talk by the author. And I said, oh, so the tone is kind of lost in the book. And it was just sort of a very nice, like, I think you sound a little stupid when you say this, like a very, very muted kind of, a very muted, nasty comment, I would say. So, I still think it could have been expressed a little bit better, but it's not, the sort of the comment that launched, the entire radical candor idea, right? This when you say, it makes you sound stupid, was actually not all that nasty. And again, I think it needs a little bit of course correction. But when you look at the whole picture, I think it actually was not just counteracted by all of the caring, it actually built off of the caring in the way that it was presented.
Yeah, and I think your point there is spot on in that trying to understand the context of what you're saying and to avoiding making a nasty comment is really important. It's like there is definitely something about the nuance of individuals and people that is hard to articulate. Because I know for me, I tend to approach a comment that could be considered nasty, a critical comment, through the lens of humor as a way of kind of lightening it. And that tends to help in 95% of situations. But I do know individual people who are not a fan of that style and they just dislike it. My wife being one of them, just not a fan of when I try to make it a funny joke and then have the criticism in there. But that works, in most work settings I've found, because I've actually had to have this exact piece of criticism, which is the ums in speaking, especially in meetings, because I have a habit of umming a lot. I also have a habit of speaking way too fast. And so I've had to work on my own speaking patterns after receiving feedback. And now that I'm in meetings with my employees and I, take note quietly of how many times they and during a meeting and then chat with them afterwards. And I've never thought it would be a good idea to tell them they're being stupid afterwards, even though I think we have a good rapport. I think the last time I did it, I kind of did that. I kind of just was like, so there's something I think we should talk about. And they went, oh God, I used too many times. I was like, yes, but you can work on it. Like, it's no big deal. And I just gave them some practical advice about how I fixed it. And I think it worked forward. I mean, I don't imagine any kind of relationship I would have with someone where I would think that's okay to say you're stupid, or you sound stupid rather, but it could exist. And I think if you understand that goes back to that, having that emotional empathy with someone.
I really like that example just because it's now I'm paying attention to myself. I know that I say a lot as well. I'm finding a real NVC thread in that approach, because what you're basically doing is you're saying, I'm not going to come to you with a subjective evaluation. I'm going to come to you and I'm going to say, I counted, and here is the number of times that you did it in this presentation. So if that bothers you, that you said, 418 times during the course of the past half hour, if you think that may be something that is hindering your presentation style, maybe that's something that we can talk about how to work on.
Yeah, exactly. And we could talk for an hour, so we'll kind of skirt some of this, but there's definitely lots of interesting things you could go into, like feedback in a code review setting versus feedback in a project setting versus feedback on a you showed up late for work again setting. Like those are very different contexts for what kind of feedback you're giving someone and how they'll receive them. But assuming we're all, adults working our careers respectfully, most of the feedback is normally something constructive, you would hope. It's something about, hey, this is the way to get better. So I don't really think there's many reasons to be, nasty about it when you're trying to improve someone earnestly. So kind of moving on past that, there was two things that Ariella brought up, and I wanted to talk about the example about the World War II pilots, which you wrote down in our notes, and I completely forgot it because it was one of the earlier chapters, and I was like, yes, this was so good.
It was awesome.
And I'll let you take it from there, and then I'll give my thoughts.
Sure. The basic story is the U.S. Air Force and the German Air Force had very different strategies as to how they use their best pilots during World War II. So the German approach was, we have really great pilots, let's send them to the front lines and they'll destroy the enemies. And the US approach was, we have really great pilots, let's take the best of the best, ship them back home, and they can train the new cadets. And that way we will make sure that we have a constant stream of, maybe not the best, right? The rock stars, the superstars, the ninjas, right? The wizards, they're going to be, not on the front lines, not doing the actual work. Instead, they're going to be doing the training so that we can have the entire organization be as effective as possible. And what happened over time was, as you might predict, when you have pilots who are going up in the air and shooting each other, every so often one of them dies. So, or at least gets taken out of commission, whether it's captured or injured or whatever. Anyway, too much imagery probably. And so over time, the Germans basically lost all their best pilots, and eventually the US attained air superiority because they had this constant stream of, again, not the ninja rock star wizards, pilots, but really, really solid, in radical candor terms, rock stars who were coming out of the system at a constant rate. And eventually the US overtook Germany in terms of air superiority. So I think it was a really good example of how when you really focus on letting the rock stars just perform and do their thing, over time, your team's going to collapse. It dies a very slow, painful death as the team does not regenerate its capabilities. And I sort of really connected this because I gave a talk at RailsConf, actually the same time that I met Amy and Justin, about the sort of the three pillars of quality software as I see them, the pillars being usefulness, sustainability, and accuracy. And this kind of feeds into the whole sustainability idea, where essentially your software is only as good as its ability to withstand the test of time. And if we're not investing in our team, we're effectively not investing in the sustainability of our software, and things are gonna die. But it applies, beyond software as well to really any kind of work environment where you care about being able to do the things you're doing today, next week, next month, next year, and next decade.
Yeah, as someone who, has always cared deeply about mentoring, who worked at companies with apprenticeships, who have worked on apprenticeship programs. My own company just started an apprenticeship program this week, and I've been inundated with, applications.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And who worked at a code school. Like, the idea of mentorship is so valuable in our industry, and just in general. I feel like I get sad sometimes hearing that other industries are just as bad about people not learning and not being able to grow and not getting the same passing down of knowledge. And I just think it's such a great way for companies to grow and for the industry to get better when you're learning from people that are your peers, but also learning from people who come before you. You're not repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, and you're creating software that should last. You're creating software that's supposed to be sustainable. It's exciting to sit down at a 10-year-old Rails project and be able to keep working on it and not just be sitting down and being terrified. That's a nice feeling to be like, okay, I have had some understanding into how this is going. Yeah, so I really enjoyed that. And I think, in general, this idea of what was the context around this story was, don't fear losing your rock stars because they could help mentor or grow someone else. And I think that's something I would plaster at every startup I've ever been to on the wall. I would, which is you take your best people and you're so terrified of them not working that you won't even bother training anyone else. That person can't lose one day or half a day a week to help someone on their team. No, they have to be working 100% of the time. and the new people have to keep up. And I know in their mind they think what they're doing is best for the business, but then I turn around and I see the business goes business goes under in a year, and I don't think it was working. Either it was unsustainable from the beginning, or this idea of we'll just marathon our way across the finish line with the software dragging behind us in 100 pieces is the correct solution. It just doesn't seem to be working out. So of course talk about mentoring, and you'll get both of us real easily in the book.
Totally. I think honestly the really sad part about it is if you think about what code quality is, think about the standard measures that people talk about, solid or Sandi Metz has true, or you have dry and testing and all these kind of metrics of code quality. And bottom line, what they're all about is, can we maintain this code? Like the vast majority of them are just about that one point, is can we maintain this code? And like, how do we, like the way that we define a great developer, the reason that we're letting, that we want great developers to be working on our code is because we want it to last. Mm-hmm. And then we just completely forget that, we actually have to invest in the team, because the team has to keep maintaining the code forever. and we just totally ignore it. And, it's sort of like, what is even the point of having great developers to develop, great software, meaning very maintainable software, and then throwing away the whole idea of, but we also need a team to maintain it.
Yeah, exactly. I've definitely, as a consultant this year alone, received a half a dozen projects which were created by a developer at some point in time and then abandoned and left to rot over the next year. And it's like, hey, did you fix this? All the tests are broken. It's like got 15 commits from 14 different people. It's just like, Band-Aids and duct tape over Band-Aids and duct tape. And I'm like, okay, we're going to fix this, and we're going to make your tests work, and we're going to help convey to you in the best way we can how to improve your process and your team to actually keep the software going over the long run, because it's going to start costing you more money to keep fixing these Band-Aids over and over and over again. And I think being able to help people with that, to teach them like process is important, mentoring is important, is valuable. I have found people on the management business side of things are not super opposed to it. They are sometimes when it's coming from their developers telling them, but they're not always opposed to it from the outside. I think it's just all perspective. I think they don't quite understand what it means, what it doesn't mean. So it gets tricky. Okay, at this point, I think we're just kind of meandering around the book. I think we're ready to come in for a landing. Is there anything else from the first half of the book you'd like to talk about, Ariel, before we close out?
There's one thing which I think you probably already know what it is, because you see the list of bullet points that I had, and there's only one that hasn't come up yet. So one thing that sort of popped out at me was the Israeli example that she brings, where basically a boss just completely chewed out one of his employees, and like she was like initially very, very shocked, but then certain experiences that she had basically made her realize, like, no, in Israel, disagreeing is a sign of respect. That's garbage. Sorry. As someone who lives in Israel, I can absolutely tell you, we are no different than anybody else. We are, there is absolutely a more aggressive culture here, and I've tried to figure out the reasons why. I have some thoughts about it. I'm not entirely sure. It's definitely true that an aggressive culture tends to breed an aggressive culture, so it's sort of very hard to make a cultural shift when, like, honestly, you have to yell sometimes to be heard. But no, we don't enjoy getting yelled at any more than anybody else. It just means that we're angry all the time, which maybe leads us to yell more. So I just you gotta kind of learn to deal with the rough and tumble of it, but to call it a sign of respect, I think is nonsense. Yeah, absolute nonsense.
Yeah, I didn't have the personal insight into that like you do, but I remember reading that and going, there was that one, and there was another one about the team in Japan, and there was a third one about some other group, and I don't have enough personal insight to say they're wrong, but they just felt like the kind of backseat speculating someone does from San Francisco about other cultures. Like, well, that's just how they are. And that reeks me as like, liberal racism, and I wasn't a fan. I'm like, we don't need to generalize people in that way. Like, being culturally sensitive is very important and like a good thing, but like we don't need to make generalities about the way certain cultures are so different than us. That leads to some very bad situations. But good.
Well, I will say that I just want to throw in, I heard from this, there's this guy Ruben Lerner who gives courses. There's some technical stuff, doesn't really matter. The point is he gives courses in I think it's in China, I want to say, and in Israel. And the Israeli course is the same material as a Chinese course, but it's a day longer, because in the Chinese course he has to like fight them to like please challenge me, and it's like pulling teeth to get it out of them. And on the Israeli side, he has to beg them to like let him continue with the material. So he always budgets an extra day for literally the same material. So there's definitely, like, you can absolutely point to differences in behavior. And there are a lot of cultural differences in behavior, but I think if psychology has taught us anything, it's that there's, in terms of what's going on, internally, there's a lot more shared humanity than there are differences. And so, that's my long way of agreeing with your disagreement.
Yeah. I won't go off on a tangent, but I did like the gavel example she gave, which was, there was a group that wouldn't give feedback. So she got like a gravel engraved, and it's like the feedback gavel or whatever. And then the first meeting with it, like, threw it to someone and said, there you go, you have to give feedback. And like, that to me feels like a very like approachable, like, okay, you understand this is now the culture of this room we're in, which is we give feedback to people. And then that got everyone over and beyond to the next thing. And I think everyone could use to grow into like this more this better approach. And I like that. That seems like a clever way than just telling someone, oh, you're not doing it correctly,
Yep, so, focusing on behavior rather than judgments.
Yes, exactly. Yes, back to NVC again.
Always back.
Always back to that. Great. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So I think we're good there. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Again, you can stay updated about Dev Empathy events by following us on Twitter @DevEmpathy. And of course, don't forget to join us on Slack using the link on our site, devempathybook.club, not bookclub.com, .club. And I look forward to interacting with you in our community. We're all in Slack. I'd love to chat with you. And let's hope we can all become better developers and better people together. And we'll be back next month for part 2 of this book, and maybe with a guest. Who knows? We'll see. All right. Bye now.
Never know. See ya.